Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 26th of March of 2023. Today we have a lot of interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with the Bakhmut area. As you know, there are very heavy clashes inside the town. The Russians took a decision, at least during the previous week, to stop or slow down their offensive operation in the vicinity of Bakhmut. If you remember, during the previous months, the Russians were trying to close the hearts of this cauldron, but the Ukrainians established a very powerful defense line from Chasov Yar to the Ivanovska in the south. As you can see, there are a lot of territory brigades, battalions, and special forces in this area. The same defense line the Ukrainians managed to establish on the north part of this of Bakhmut, and the Russians couldn't close the cauldron. So that's why during this week, and I believe that the next weeks, the Russians are going to continue the same tactic. They're trying to attack Ukrainian forces inside the town, and mainly there are very heavy clashes in the central part of this town. The Russians have some attempts in the western part of Bakhmut, mainly in the southwestern part and the northwestern part of Bakhmut, but the main clashes are inside the central part. The Russians are saying that during the previous 24 hours, as a result of heaviest clashes on the north of Bakhmut, they managed to establish control over Azov steel plant, over this territory. Some sources are saying that the Russians cleared the entire territory, but I think that it's like a small speculation about that, because they have established just over the northern part, but as you can see, this is a very big industrial area, and there are a lot of industrial buildings and facilities to the south of in the central part as well. So the Russians managed to clear just the northern part, and I believe that the next week they're going to continue their movements from the north to the south. Furthermore, as you can see, according to some sources, the Russians managed to cross the railroad that split Bakhmut from in two parts. I'm talking about the western part and the central part. The Russians crossed the area and managed to establish small bridgehead on this side, like on the south part of this water reservoir, on the south from this small area Yahidne, from the town by the name of Yahidne. There are clashes here in this area as well, but this is a very difficult area to develop bridgehead, because there is a residential area with very big buildings. So I believe that the Russians, if they are able to hold this area for more than 2 days, I believe that later they will try to develop this area. But for now, I believe that this is some kind of attack when the Russians were trying to pin down and freeze the Ukrainians' reserves that could be sent in direction of Azov steel plant. There are very heavy clashes on the southern part of Bakhmut, as you can see, and as we discussed many videos ago when we were trying to split Bakhmut into many pieces, trying to understand where exactly the Wagnerians or the Russians were going to attack. I thought that the industrial zone is going to be the last place where the Russians would try to make attempt to storm, but we see I was mistaken about that. The Russians, we can say, established control of the northern part, like the first part, even talking about Bakhmut, and now they're trying to storm Bakhmut from the south, because it's like a residential area with very small buildings. There are very heavy clashes in the vicinity of airport stadium. In this area, the Russians are saying that there are clashes, and there are very heavy clashes between two streets, the Korsunskova street, this one that located right in front, that goes from the Ivanovska exactly to the Russian territory, and Chaikovska, there's two yellow lines, this is the Chaikovskova street. And this is the road that Ukrainians uses, or at least still have possibility to use, to support the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. I don't think that Ukrainians are able to use this road these days, currently these hours. I believe that mainly they're using the fields that located on the north from this street. But anyway, this is some kind of a final barrier that the Ukrainians try to hold to stop the Russians and not to allow them to close the head of a cauldron. For these purposes, the Ukrainians took a decision to send one of the most powerful and experienced forces in this area. I'm talking about the Forces of Special Operation. So this is like Special Forces Ukrainian, and they have just one task: not to push the Wagnerians, not to, to make counter-offensive operation. No, they have just one task: to hold this bridgehead, the western part of Bakhmut, and to keep the road, and to keep this road safe, and not to allow the Russians to close the head of cauldron. To help them, the Ukrainians sent the 63rd Mechanized Brigade in this area with one purpose, just to support and be some kind of manpower or meat for these special forces, but not to allow the Russians to cross the Khersonskova Street and Tchaikovskova Street. And when talking about these buildings, this is the most important area for the Ukrainians, and how long the Ukrainians are able to hold these big buildings. At the same time, the Ukrainians are able to not allow the Russians to close the hat of Cauldron. There are very heavy clashes in the south, and the most important streets are Shirokaya Street, this street goes right in the south from the stadium, and Mariupolskaya Street. So the heaviest clashes right exactly on the north from this cross. If we take a look at this map, we see that the main forces that located in this area is Western Chechensky forces like Ichkerian battalions, battalion of Dudayev, and there are some National Guard forces and so on. They're stepping back. I believe that the Russians will continue pushing in this area because this residential area with the very slow buildings, so this is exactly the things that the Russians likes, and they understand that to push from the south, they will have less losses in comparison, let's say, with the western part or the northwestern part or the central part. Also, today we received a piece of information that the Russians managed to develop their bridgehead on the school number 5, and they are moving along the Nizalezhная Street, this yellow line, and there are very heavy clashes between the Nizalezhная Street, Mariupolskaya Street, and the street that located right in the vicinity of Marketplace, улица Bazarная Street. So this is the area where the Russians have heaviest clashes, and the Russians sources are saying, and the Ukrainians confirms that neither have success, that like 50-50 situation. And the thing is that when talking about this area, the Russians have already entered or got the central part of Bakhmut, where we can find a lot of high buildings. So this is the reason why the Russians are so slow in this area, and this is the reason why it's so difficult for them to penetrate this area. But I believe that they will try to increase the bridgehead in this area, and they will increase the pressure from this side as well, trying to push the Ukrainians from the central part of Bakhmut to the western part of Bakhmut, and try to push the Ukrainians to cross this railroad. And after that, we're going to see the final stage of battle for Bakhmut. Most of the Russian sources are saying, and the Ukrainians confirms, that upcoming week is going to be like the most important, and the upcoming week is going to determine the situation in Bakhmut and will determine like the next months of clashes around in the vicinity of Bakhmut. Furthermore, some Russian sources are saying that during the next week, the Ukrainians or the Russians are planning to restore their push in direction of Minkovka. The Russians want to develop this bridgehead, and the most important is that the Russians are trying and want to get this channel, and to finally to establish control over Orekhovo-Vasilievka. The Russian sources are saying, and the Ukrainians confirms, that Orekhovo-Vasilievka is in the gray zone. Nobody controls this town. There are a number of checkpoints in this area, but because of the fact that the Russians controls the hills that located on the east-north part of Orekhov in this area, in the vicinity of Zalesnyanska, that's why it is very difficult to hold Orekhovo-Vasilievka. So that's why mainly during the night period of time there are very heavy clashes, and let's say in the morning the Russians establish control over some checkpoints, and by the evening the Ukrainians returns control over this checkpoint. To establish 100% control over this area, the Russians first need to take control over Minkovka. And one more time, the Russians are saying that they're planning to restore the pressure in this direction. After that, as soon as the Russians establish control over this bridgehead, they will be able to turn to the south and start moving in direction of Bogdanovka and Chasov Yar. And this is going to be the final thing that the Russians need to establish 100% control over Bakhmut. So this is the plans of the Russians about the area that located in the vicinity of Bakhmut. And when talking about the Bakhmut itself, as we discussed, they will try to move from the south and from the north, and to try the Ukrainians to push from the central part to the western part of Bakhmut. The Russian sources are saying, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours, as a result of clashes on the Donetsk front line, the Ukrainians lost 200 soldiers, 11 armored vehicles, and 6 artillery systems. As you can see, the losses of Ukrainians are high. very high, but in comparison with the previous days, not so high. If you remember, during the week we had the numbers like more than 350 soldiers, and there was a day when the Ukrainians lost more than 400 soldiers during the day. The Western sources are saying that Ukrainians loses from 1 to 200 forces during the day in the vicinity of Bakhmut. So the losses are very heavy, but the Ukrainians managed to accumulate and collect a lot of reserves, a lot of forces. So for now they are able to spend some blood, to spill some blood in this area with one purpose: to win some time, to get more armored vehicles, more Western weapons, and maybe after that they will start their own movements and they are going to show us something. Now let's move to Avdiivka. This is another town of Donetsk front line. As you can see, the Western sources map has been updated. Mainly this map is built based on the reports of Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, and as you can see, the bridgehead in the vicinity of Avdiivka, for the Russian bridgehead in the vicinity of Avdiivka has been changed, and the most important updates are that the Russians, according to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, managed to develop their bridgehead between towns Toninka, Sporn, and Lastочkin. As you can see, the Russians haven't established control over any of these towns, but they managed to get the bridgehead between these towns, and I believe that now the Russians have physical fire control over the roads that connects these towns between each other. So that means that they need to spend some time before the forces that located in these towns would be out of ammo, and after that the Russians will be able to restore the pressure and to take control over all these towns. And this is the most important thing, the most important goal that the Russians need to complete within the next week. We see that the Russians have, according to this map and according to reports we receive from the front lines, we know that the Russians are trying to push from the south, but we see that they still haven't established control over any town in this area. And this is exactly what they need. They need some kind of checkpoint, some kind of base, some kind of fortification they can rely on. They are able to develop the entire bridgehead on the west part from Avdiivka. So this is the reason, this is the vital question for the Russians to establish control over at least one of these towns. I believe that the first town that is going to fall is going to be Severna, of course, later Toninka, but first they need to do this. Very interesting piece of information are coming from the north bridgehead in the vicinity of Krasnogorovka and Novobakhmutovka. As you can see, the Russians completely stopped their movements in direction of Berdych and Stepovo, these two towns, but as you can see, there are very interesting updates are coming from the north part of this bridgehead. Today, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine reported that as a result of clashes on this front line, the Ukrainians managed to repulse the attack from the Russian side in the vicinity of the town by the name of Keramik. So as you can see, Keramik is located very far, let's say at the back of the towns by the name of Novokalinova and Beta Agroinvest, these two towns and the farm. So there are many options, of course. Maybe the Russians were able to pass by these towns like Novokalinova and to attack Keramik, let's say, from the east in this direction, or maybe the Russians have already established control over Novokalinova and Beta Agroinvest. We haven't received these updates from the Russian sources, but anyway, the situation in this very area is very interesting. As we discussed, the Ukrainians are trying to send the reserves from Machertine in this area, and I believe that these days the Ukrainians were forced to change their rotation tactic in this area. I believe that because of this very heavy situation on the north, the Ukrainians were forced to change their tactic to supply the Ukrainian forces in Avdiivka, and the only road, at least now, they're able to use is through the town by the name Zhelanne, this one. I believe that now this is this town that Ukrainians uses to support forces in Semyonovka, Orlovka, and then to Avdiivka. So this is the only road, safe road, that Ukrainians are able to use to supply and support forces in Avdiivka. I believe that this road is, of course, under fire control, under artillery control, but in comparison with the road from Machertine, this road looks more secure in comparison with this, of course. Now let's go to the south and let's talk about Marinka. The Russian sources are saying that as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, they managed to develop the bridgehead in this town. They're pushing on the northern part, they're pushing in the central part, but as we can see, there are still a lot of towns, a lot of blocks, a lot of streets that remains under Ukrainian control. And as we see, the Russians, let's say, started the active battle for Marinka somewhere in November of the previous year. They promised to establish control over this town by the end of the previous year, but we see that we can say that the progress was almost the same. So I believe that I'm not sure that the Russians are able to establish control over Marinka in the very near future. Very interesting updates are coming from the north of Marinka, from the area between Krasnogorovka and Staromikhailivka. We haven't seen and haven't received any reports about any clashes inside this town. This is another fortification area, the same as Marinka. There are a lot of fortifications, a lot of trenches. The Ukrainians prepared this town start preparation at the beginning of 2014, so it's very old fortifications, and the Russians will need a lot of time to crack this nut. But the Russians are saying that as a result of clashes during the previous days, they managed to reduce the gray zone between Krasnogorovka and Staromikhailivka. So all these events are saying that the Russians have already reduced the gray zone with one purpose: to start storming operation of this town. So we'll see whether they're going to do this or not, but this is a very interesting piece of information. Now let's go to the South Donetsk front line. There are no changes on the ground, just artillery duels, and the Russians are saying that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 60 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems D-30. The same situation, not just about Ugledar, it's like the South Zaporozhye and Ugledar front line. When talking about Kherson, there are also artillery duels in this area, and as a result of those artillery duels, the Ukrainians lost 20 soldiers and 2 artillery systems, Akatse and M777 Howitzer. Now let's talk about this north front lines, about Liman and Kupiansk. As you can see, there are icons in this area saying that there were very heavy clashes, and the Russians are saying that as a result of clashes on Liman front line, the Ukrainians lost 90 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems D-30, but without any changes on the ground. In the same situation about the Kupiansk front line, there are very heavy artillery duels in this area. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes, the Ukrainians lost at least 2 Polish Krabs in this area. Furthermore, the Russians reported about discovering 5 commandos groups. They were discovered and destroyed by the Russians, and the total number of losses on the Kupiansk front line from the Ukrainian side is 70 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. So as you can see, the level of losses in comparison with the previous day is higher, but not so high in comparison with Donbas front line and even Liman front line. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.